Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you and welcome to the first episode of Leader Freak Public Economics Hub. My name is Omukoko Korp. Leader Freak Public Economics Hub exists for several purposes. The first of those is to ensure that Kenyan economic policy is understood by everyday Kenyans. It is also to make sure that every Kenyan understands economics and economic decisions that affect their daily livelihood. If there's one thing that affects nearly every one of us, it is economic policy, it is economic conditions, it's economic decisions. It's important to understand how unemployment works, to understand how government raises their taxes, to understand why prices go up, they don't. But more than that, we also want to understand the progress that Kenya has made by reflecting on historical documents, understanding those documents properly, knowing the trajectory that Kenya set on, and how far it has gone in that regard. We do this by relying on data that is provided by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. We read these documents carefully and intensively, analyze them, and break them down so that every Kenyan understands how our government and how the economic environment operates within our country. This is our first episode of many to come. And in this episode, we are talking about Sessional paper number 10. This was the first document that was drafted outlining Kenya's economic blueprint, if you may. There are other documents that may have talked about economics and how Kenya will approach economics. We can think about the KANU Manifesto, which was written before this document. But this is seen as the first major document that set out the path for economic development for Kenya. So it's important to understand this document so that we know where we came from, but also to keep a historical record. And we read these papers, or at least I do for now, before we grow our team, to understand them and to make sure that I can share them with other Kenyans who may not have gotten the time to go through them as keenly and as carefully. So, Sessional paper number 10 was written in 1965. This was about 18 months after independence. And for those of you who have taken a few history classes, you will understand that this period was a period of intense rivalry between the West and the East, the Soviet Union and United States, and its allied countries in the Western Hemisphere. It was the Cold War period, and we had the very serious, significant Cold War rivalry. And a lot of other countries were caught in between these fighting superpowers. And it's a Cold War because the superpowers did not face off each other, but there was a heavy expectation that other countries will pick a side. And these two superpowers will do everything possible, one, to make allies, and two, to eliminate any threat that they see, whether real or perceived. And so African countries gaining independence felt intense pressure. They were pressured from both sides because each side wanted Africa to adopt its ideological viewpoints. So the West wanted capitalism to spread, and the East, or the Soviet Union, wanted communism to spread to the African continent. And so you can think of this document as a way for the Kenyan government at the time to end the ideological debate. And the ideological debate also makes sense because during this context, every government in Africa that was gaining independence was deciding which path to follow. You may think of Tanzania, which decided to go with Ujamaa or communism. And so that debate was not just external. It was not just a question of choosing East versus West. It was also a question of people within the government solving their divisions and bringing harmony to their decisions, unifying their decision and deciding that the best way forward for our country is either this side or the other, as opposed to having this friction or fractures within the early movements and early governments of the African continent. And this is what this document seeks to do, to end this debate and decide that this is the path that Kenya is following and everyone should come on board, and we don't have to waste more time wondering whether we should develop the Soviet Union way or the Western way or whatever it is. The other important aspect of this document is that it is a pretty accurate diagnosis of Kenya's economic reality at the time. And we will see this as we go further into the discussion. But at the time, Kenya had a severe shortage of manpower. Education was just barely getting off the ground. Healthcare was as bad as it gets. And the economy was dominated by expatriates, foreigners. And so at the time, because we just did not have enough Kenyans trained to take on these jobs, we did not have the skilled manpower, we did not have the resources. And so this document captures that quite accurately. It's also a document that asserts Kenyan sovereignty. And remember, this is a newly independent country that is excited to be independent and to assert that independence, to assert that sovereignty. And we see this because Kenya says that it is adopting African socialism. It also says that it's not following the East or the West. It is non-aligned. And it is not adopting any particular system, communism or capitalism, but African socialism. It says that it will work with countries, any country. It will get information from other countries. It will discard what it does not want or does not need, and it will adopt what it thinks is suitable to it. It says it's very flexible, and it will work with countries, but not with any strings attached. And so it will develop on its own terms. That's what we see throughout this document, a clear emphasis. And so the core idea of this document is that Kenya will borrow selectively. If we like something, we'll pick it. If we don't, we'll reject it. And Kenya will also reject imposed ideology. So the Soviet Union or the Western capitalism will not dictate Kenya's future path. And that Kenya will pursue growth on its own term. That's important to set the context of this document. But we also think about the way the economy was structured at the time. At the time, the economy was mainly structured to benefit non-Africans. And Africans were only used to provide free or cheap labor and to provide taxes. And so most of the economic structure, the infrastructure that was developed, everything that was set up in a manner that did not benefit Africans. And so once Kenya gains independence, there is also the need to transition from subsistence farming to a monetary economy. And there was also the need to shift from agricultural dependence towards balanced growth. And it's important to recognize that at this time, and I think to this day, agriculture played such a significant role in Kenya's economy. We did not have a balanced growth, and that dependence on agriculture was something that this document realized back then, that there was need to shift from that reliance exclusively on agriculture and getting more balanced growth from other sectors. And it's also a document that recognizes at the time that poverty, disease, and the lack of education were the main obstacles that Kenya faced towards its goals, ambitions, and the progress that it aimed to achieve. And so, noting all this, and given the context, it was clear from the onset that the task would not be an easy one, and that it required very careful planning, and the document attempts to achieve this. This paper begins by saying that every society has objectives. And it says that these objectives are similar across societies. They are universal objectives. And some of the objectives that it identifies are political equality, social justice, human dignity, and the freedom of conscience, freedom from want, disease, and exploitation, equal opportunity, high and rising per capita incomes, equitably distributed. So this document says that these objectives are objectives that are universal every society has these objectives. But there are differences in the weight placed on each of these objectives. So every society might have a different weight, say for political equality or for social justice or for human dignity. But the same objectives apply. The other difference is the methods used to achieve them. Every society decides for itself what methods it will use to achieve the stated objectives. And so Kenya says, like every other society, is committed to these objectives and will begin to work towards achieving the ends of these objectives in its own ways. And that's where African socialism comes in as the vehicle that Kenya will use to achieve this stated objective. The key argument here is that African socialism is not a foreign concept. It is not imported. It is not an ideological imposition from elsewhere or from other parts of the world. They say it is rooted in African traditions. It comes from Africa. But our key characteristics of African socialism as defined in this document is that it is open to borrowing compatible techniques from other regions of the world. And so we do not close ourselves from learning. African socialism is adaptable, it is open. It talks about it being rooted in African traditions. As I mentioned, it is adaptable to change and it is independent of any satellite relationship with other countries. In other words, no country in the world but Kenya decides what African socialism is for Kenya and how it's applied in Kenyan context. So it's not dependent on any other country, the West, the East, United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, name them. And it says that this African socialism comes from two fundamental traditions that are African traditions. The first of those traditions is political democracy. And the document argued that there was equality in Africa, regardless of how wealthy someone was. You may have been rich as a leader in Africa. You may have a lot of cows, a lot of wealth in different forms. You may have had a lot of gold. But whenever you had wealth, you served as a trustee of society. In other words, there was no first class, second class, or third class, or whatever class of citizens. And the threshold to participate in democratic process was very simple. As long as you're a mature adult, you are able to participate in the democratic governance of your community and of your society. So that is the first fundamental tradition that informs African socialism, political democracy. The second tradition is mutual social responsibility, that in Africa, societies worked around the concept of shared prosperity, and that there was shared responsibility to achieve education, health, and security. And so the state has the responsibility to carry out this mutual social responsibility of ensuring that there is education, there is healthcare, there is security. But more importantly, participation in development is a social duty. Because in traditional African societies, there was an expectation that you will participate positively towards your community, towards your society, and that this participation is out of mutual social responsibility. If I do well for the community, everyone does well. And if I do wrong for the community, then no one does well. So those are the two concepts that form the foundations of African socialism, as this document defines it. Now, this document goes further to speak a little bit more about ideology, and it starts by critiquing Western capitalism for the economic structure, the economic dominance, that those who had economic power had outsized political control. It also criticizes communism for the rigidity and also for the political control. In other words, it says that Western capitalism and communism are both, by their very nature, undemocratic and therefore inconsistent with the African tradition. And that is why African socialism is important as the preferred way forward for the African society and the Kenyan society at the time. One key thing about the way they talked about African socialism is that African socialism was very adaptable. In other words, Kenya was not committing to a specific ideology. It was not setting out to believe that we must be communist and therefore we must check all these boxes, or we are capitalist and therefore we must act in this way or the other. But what was very important at the time for Kenya was that it remains very adaptable. And so no ideology will stop it from trading with other countries. And that Kenya will be very practical in its application of policy, and that we are not going to decide on the basis of ideology, but on the basis of pragmatic consideration of the issues at hand. And so that is set out very clear, that we are not wedded to any ideology. We are not committed fully to any particular ideology. Our standing is that we will do what is right and necessary to ensure that the growth of Kenya is realized. The second thing that it says is Kenya is choosing to be non-aligned. We are not economically aligned with any particular bloc, not the Eastern Bloc, not the Western Bloc, not United States, not Soviet Union. We are not aligned. That is the message that comes out clear in this document. But that does not mean that we want to isolate ourselves. What this document says is that Kenya will participate in trade, and it advocates for freedom of trade globally. It says that no ideology will stop it from acting trade. In other words, Kenya will pursue its interests with anyone and everyone. It will learn from Western capitalism. It will learn from communism, from the Soviet Union, and it will learn from any country. So Kenya is not stopping itself from working with any country or blocking any countries purely on the basis of ideological difference. And that is something important to note about this document. And so Kenya accepts aid, it accepts exchange of technology, it accepts working with other countries on all levels, except that it does not want any political strings attached to any of those engagements. And this is made very clear throughout the document. And the result of all this is that now we have a mixed economy, which draws very selectively towards the East and the West. So Kenya was very much in the middle, swaying one way and the other based on what was needed at the time. And there are many important examples of this. For instance, we have the state, which has significant role in the Kenyan society. But we also have the private enterprise, which is allowed to thrive. And so it was a very careful balancing act, especially on paper, for Kenya. And we ended up with a mixed economy that defined Kenya's growth and development at the time, as opposed to going one way or the other. And so it's very hard to say that Kenya was capitalist. Some people will argue it was, or communist, and some people may have a little of argument to make. But the truth is that Kenya ended up being a mixed economy, picking some aspects of socialism, communism, and some aspects of Western capitalism. This document also now talks about ownership, and thinking about ownership of property, ownership of land. And remember, this is a very thorny issue. And it starts by saying that ownership in Africa, in African traditional societies, took various forms. There was property that was owned by individuals. There was property that was owned by the entire tribe. There was property that was owned by cooperatives. Think of it any way you want to think about. And it says that that is what we will continue. The state will own some of the property. Cooperatives will own some of the property. Corporates, the companies will own property. Individuals will own property. The key principle is that that property, whoever owns it, should not matter as much as the responsible use of resources. That at the end of the day, the most important question to be answered is how are these resources being used, as opposed to who owns them and who does not. It also preserves the state authority to intervene. So whenever government feels that resources are being wasted, that the public interest is harmed by any person owning any resource, be it private or anyone, anywhere, or that the national security is threatened, or the national integrity is threatened, then Kenya, as a state, retained the authority to use tools available to it to intervene in such situations to ensure that the key principle of proper and responsible use of resources is maintained. The other problem that this paper tries to confront is Africanization. Remember, Africanization is essentially making sure that the economy, the country, became more African. Remember, we are coming from a context where everything is run by expatriates, by foreigners, by Europeans, and very little participation of Africans in the economy in a meaningful way. And so Africanization is the concept of trying to make sure that now Africans are taking over these jobs, they're taking over these opportunities, they're taking over these resources. And the constitution, the document at the time recognized that this was urgent, but there were some constraints. One of the major constraints is that the Constitution guaranteed equal rights for all citizens. The Constitution did not say for white citizens, for black citizens, for Indian citizens, or for Asian citizens. No, the Constitution did not create that distinction. And therefore, if the economy has been set in such a way that it is against Africans, it's very hard to restrict that without violating the Constitution. Because if the Constitution is founded on a setting that is inherently unequal, to balance that inequality, you have to step on a few people. And so that was the biggest constraint that the Kenyan government had. In other words, if a European owned land in Kenya and was a citizen of Kenya, the government could not expropriate that land just anyhow, because now this was a citizen of the country. If any person controlled any resources, whatever the amount is, if this person was a citizen of the Republic of Kenya, then the government was constrained because the government committed to honoring every citizen. And that's what the Constitution said. And that was what the Kano Manifesto spelled out. And so this was the biggest constraint towards Africanization. So even though there was a will to make sure that Africans participate in the economy, that was a huge constraint. And so the government resorted to using alternative methods of achieving Africanization without stepping on any constitutional rights of any single citizen, whatever, irrespective of their color. So the government focused on training, it focused on increasing participation and building long-term capacity for Africans to participate in this growth process. And so it set out a lot of initiatives, but it was not the immediate hard correction that some people had expected, that to Africanize, we must take resources from maybe Europeans or from wherever. That did not happen because, as mentioned, the Constitution said that every citizen was protected under the Constitution and that they all had their rights and that all of them, regardless of who they looked like, had those rights protected by the government. So Africanization became very difficult to achieve in that sense and in that regard. The document also delves into the constraints, the issues that we had, the shortages that we had. And the first shortage was domestic capital. We did not have sufficient capital. There was a significant shortage in that regard. And so that naturally led to reliance on external capital. So we had to expect that foreigners will invest some capital into our economy because on our own, we could not because of the constraints that we had in that regard, the shortage. Remember, this is a young nation, barely 18 months. It cannot even crawl. And it's all on its own. It does not have a mother government. And so we are all trying to figure it out quickly and to a level best. But the other significant shortage was shortage of skilled manpower. At the time, Kenya had 25 qualified surveyors, and only 2 of them were Africans. It had 811 doctors, and only about 50 of them were African. There were only 22 hydraulic engineers, and only 1 was African. And the same could be said of any profession. Teachers or teachers of teachers training colleges, a very small percentage of them were Africans at the time. And so to respond to this reality, Kenya had to take measures, because you have to survive today. You have to live today. You do not just live on the expectation that the future will change or will be somehow different. You have to act today. And so it had to rely on external borrowing, because there wasn't much within the country to count on or to use. It had to rely on expatriates. As I mentioned, most of the professions in the country were people who were hired from outside Kenya. And so that reliance was necessary, otherwise the government will collapse. And so we had to keep counting on foreigners to contribute their labor. At that time, when Kenya wanted to hire someone, it would go and hire and recruit them from outside the country. For sometimes not even the hardest of jobs, but we were not there yet, and education was just beginning to pick up. Things were just beginning to pick up. And so Kenya adopted these, we have to act today, we have to do this strategy of we have to act today, we have to borrow from outside, we have to rely on expatriates to do the job in Kenya, we have to recruit externally while we slowly build progress and capacity in our country. And that is the approach that Kenya used. And so the logic there is we have to do everything to ensure that we can survive in the short term while buying time for the long-term objectives of internal self-reliance. The next thing that this document captures and talks about is the policy choices that were made. And on tax policy, it talked about pay as you earn tax reform structure. The challenge we had is that even though income grew in some cases, the tax system was not catching up quickly. In other words, the government was constantly collecting less taxes than it was able to. We had to think about progressive taxes in inheritance and capital gains, property and excise taxes, charges for public services, as ways to bridge this capital and revenue raising gap. The document also talks about welfare and says, yes, welfare is important. These goals need to be achieved. Socialism, African socialism, promotes welfare, a society where university students are given financial aid. Education is free. Healthcare is free. But it also accepted that if we provided all that, the government will go broke, it will be impractical, and the future goals will all be delayed even further, or they might not even be achieved at all. And so there is this recognition. And what I like about this document is how it interrogates reality. It does a very good reality check and then makes practical considerations. To their credit, this was a document that was very practical on the basis of what was there at the time. It was not ideological. It is not a question of just saying things for the sake of making promises that look good on paper. It was really a genuine understanding of where Kenya was, what could be done and what could not be done, and the best way forward given the constraints that existed. It also talked a little bit about agriculture as the best example of African socialism in practice, because cooperatives work together, individuals own land, the nation owned land. So we had all these different forms of ownership. And it really created an emphasis on the need for cooperatives, because a lot of Kenyans were small-scale farmers or middle scale, whatever you consider it. And so they needed cooperatives to get that scale. If you, as one farmer, can produce 10 bags of maize, you can't do much with that. But if a group of 300 farmers come together and they work with the same cooperatives, and then now you're talking about tons, and that gives you scale. If you want to export, if you want to process, if you want to, you get some advantages of scale by bringing in cooperatives. And then there was also the national farms, and the national farms were important in providing services such as seeds, quality seeds, ensuring that we have livestock that is of great quality. And so that is what the national farms focused on at the time, and bringing in some reforms in the colonial structures to the extent possible. Remember, all this is working within the constraints of the time. So as I bring it to a close, this is a document about choices. It is a document about trade-offs, but it's also a document about the constraints that Kenya faces. It's a document that deals with major questions. What is the role of the state? How much power should our country have? Should the state have? And what is the best way to pursue growth? Because Kenya, in the document, needed rapid economic development as the only sustainable and permanent solution to its challenges. That's what the document says. And so there are all these questions of how do we get there. The outcome of this document and this argument is that we ended up having a mixed economy in Kenya, an economy that borrows from the East and the West. We had a strong centralized government. So the government, the state, we have a very big state, if you may, which you can say is a characteristic of the Eastern communism. But we also had space for private enterprise, which is more characteristic of Western capitalism. So we have a blend of different ideologies, of different ways of doing things. And that is true of many countries even today. It is very hard to find a country on the planet now that is strictly social communist or strictly capitalist. It's always a blend of the two. And at the time, this was quite significant given just the tension that existed between different countries. I will finalize by saying that what this document identified is that African socialism was not a rigid ideology. And in my mind, it was really just practical realism. This is where we are, this is what we will do, and this is how we will get where we want to get. Thank you for staying with me for the last half hour, and I hope you learned something about sessional paper number 10. There is more to come. Next time we will be looking at Vision 2030. What are the promises? What have we achieved? How far have we gotten? And what is left? Thank you so much once again for being with me. And I hope you can follow and check us out at leaderfreak.com, where we provide more economic information on economic policy, on the different initiatives that are taken in the country. And our goal is to ensure that every Kenyan understands the economy and can participate with full knowledge. Thank you.